We have an excellent question from Rafał Pankowski, Never Again Association, that I'll just read, and anyone on the panel or each of the panelists could respond. What do you think we can learn from the globality of World War II to build global solidarity across continents against contemporary instances of human rights abuses and genocide? And we can perhaps Ernesto wants to begin with revisiting, I think, your really brilliant insights to how this one touchstone that is the United Nations first definition of genocide in the wake of the Nazi Holocaust. And yet we've got Raphael Lemkin using the Armenian genocide to define genocide, but the world needed to know about Nazis before figuring it out. And yet we have ongoing instances of genocide. And I should make clear, I am sitting on Native American soil made possible by the genocide of the Pequots. So it's, here we are. Would anybody like to address the globality of histories of World War II to address or to cope with ongoing histories of extreme violence? I should emphasize the state-sponsored nature of the violence we're talking about.
Okay, thanks, Alexis, for the question. I do not have something very solid to say about, but I could say I am skeptical about the human capability to learn about the past. When I decided to study history, I felt exactly the opposite. No? I thought that we could learn from our mistakes and then, I don't know, living in a better world. Nowadays, I am a bit more pessimistic about that. What I could say is that probably the World War II has spread feelings of global solidarity, but did not invent them. I think, for instance, watching the problem from Latin America, I think that the Spanish Civil War was probably much more important in order to stimulate these particular international identifications. The perception of that in the Madrid battle, there were not faced just two Spanish enemies, but two particular transnational enemies, which generated assimilation and also rejection. So the Spanish Civil War contributed firmly to the development of these global solidarities that for sure fought against other global solidarities. The fascist governments also launched their own global connections and solidarity movements. It's clear that the fascist side of the world was not as strong as the anti-fascist movements. But in my opinion, I think we have to think of globality much more as a contested field, much more than as a universal stream potentially shared by all the people. I think that we could think much more in terms of competing global projects, more than as the emergence of unified global conscience.
I think let me add something to. I think I'm going to build on Joseph's really pertinent contribution in terms of his thoughts about World War I versus World War II. And I think what Joseph has mentioned is really connected to this question, because first of all, we have to think about the meanings of the war and the meanings of the trauma to each group. So I think which is linked to somehow to, first of all, we have to translate the experiences of each groups, and before we start talking about the commonality, because every nation, every group within every nation is coming from, in terms of class, they're coming from their own perspective. And I think until we do that, that's why, first of all, we have to learn more about the facts. And this is where the archives, history, oral history, and so on and so forth are important. Then when we get to these discourses of what's common and how we can build these solidarities, I think that's something that would come next. Are we there? I don't think so. I don't think we're not there yet. And but we will be there. That's why a panel like this and the conversation with teachers like this are important. We'll be there if we are able to translate these experiences to the students through their own languages and through the experience of their own people, the experience of their own communities. And I think that's potentially the best I think the best solution to building these alliances in the future.
Joseph, would you like to say something there?
Yeah, in fact, I don't have much to say or to add, but I would maybe bounce back on the last point made by Aomar. What strikes me in this part of the world regarding World War II is the very, and this is where I completely concur with Ernesto about the pessimism or the skepticism about learning something from this on the global scale. What strikes me here in this part of the world is the very deeply entrenched denialism of certain things that have happened in Europe, for example, in Eastern Europe or in Europe. I think the Middle East, I don't know scientifically, but I have the feeling that it is probably the part of the world where denialism of the Holocaust and etc. is the strongest, probably in the collective, in the popular discourse, in the popular, let's say, narrative and etc. And this has to do, of course, with the Arab-Israeli problem, but it is not read as a European traumatic event. It is read as a part of the Arab-Israeli conflict and not as part of the European history, the traumatic and very difficult European history. And for someone who, for example, like me, who teaches political history in the American university, I used to teach political science in France for 15 years. Now I've been teaching this in Lebanon, and I can see how the perception, the cultural perception, sometimes the conviction that is entrenched in the minds and the heads of the students is very different. They don't live the same event the same way, and sometimes they even deny that this event has happened, or they minimize it. So we're still very far from having constructed a global awareness towards these issues, and I think that I would agree with my two colleagues that this is something that will probably take much more efforts and energy and probably intellectual input to construct.
If I could just add in from East Asia, where I think in East Asia, we run a close second, if not a neck and neck tie on denialism. The East Asian denialism of certain factual occurrences aided and abetted by the United States government's determination to sweep history under the rug in order to build an anti-communist bloc at all costs immediately following the defeat of Japan, to the extent that I think only in American high school or American history textbooks is the word good used with the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's an untranslatable word in any other nation's history, which I guess I would emphasize very much Omar's, especially to the teachers in the audience, who are coming up with lesson plans of a multi-perspectival approach to this particular era of the 20th century, a the multiplicity of materials, as many different source materials as possible. Those of us who are doing the speaking today all have our degrees we've obtained our PhDs at times in which you needed a certain amount of certain materials to pass your exams. And there's a sort of hierarchy of documented archival evidence. Aomar very smartly put up a US government document to show that a certain history had taken place. And we also have a diary, a first-person account. And I think for those teaching this in areas around the world today, we're still in a position of hearing from survivors of some of these atrocities, some of these histories of terror that really do reach students in a new way. And I find that the first person voice, while of course always needs to be substantiated as any criminal trial would do. You know, you're making a claim against a state, and making any claim against a state apparatus is probably the single most difficult thing to do, regardless of whether one's in a dictatorship or a democracy, actually. And so bringing these claims forward through diaries, through songs, through film footage, while it is still possible to bolster the argument with a living survivor, is key in terms of reaching students in a new way to explain the potential cataclysm of another war on this scale. And I don't mean to be the voice of darkness, but I am actually increasingly terrified of the rhetoric of the rise of China. I mean, the United States is clearly positioning itself to have another global conflict. Whether or not it comes to pass, we obviously hope does not happen. But the rhetoric is building in a way that one sees similar patterns in the 1930s, and therefore it's imperative on those of us who have access to the generation for which nothing is inevitable until it happens, to introduce the costs of such cataclysmic violence. And that's through individual stories, through the people caught in state webs of terror that bring it forward. And I agree with the panelists that finding a global World War II history, we're not there yet. Finding, I'm thinking of Achille Mbembe's wonderful work, A Global History of Violence. I think we're closer to understanding and bringing it to the fore that way.